Lech Lecha is the parsha in which God reaches out to Avram. He initiates the relationship. He comes to Avram and says, come to my place, come with me. Be mine. Which is very powerful, very emotional, very, very touching. Avram was a good man. He was 75 years old at the time that happened. And he had discovered God, he understood God, he taught about God, he introduced God to everyone in town, even though his father was the idol maker. And then at 75 years old, God comes to him and says, I need you. Very powerful. But Lech Lecha is God communicating to Avram, as we spoke about. His name was not Avraham yet, it was still Avram.
Right.
Avram means the father of many. By adding the Hey, the letter Hey, to make it Avraham, his entire condition, his entire personality was transformed from very good to godly. Because everything that he had done until that point was as good as a human being can get. He had all the right ideas, all the right attitudes, the love of God, his emotions, his heart, and his mind were all in the right place. And that's as good as a human being can get on his own. In Lech Lecha, God reaches out to him and says there's more. There's something beyond the capacity of a human being to find God. There's also God making himself available to the human being. And then you've got a completely new creation, different person. One of the differences was that the five senses that human beings have, which we cannot control, they're involuntary. You see what you see because it presents itself in front of your eyes. You hear what you hear because there was a sound, and you bump into what you bump into and you feel it. And if you put something in your mouth, you'll taste it. You can't not taste it. So the five senses are usually involuntary. We have no control over them. So if we don't want to hear what's going on, we have to make ourselves absent. We got to go someplace else. If you don't want to see what there is, you got to go somewhere else, find a different scene, and so on. But when God added the Hey to Avraham's name, he gave him control over his senses. And from then on, Avraham saw only what he wanted to see. If there was something unholy in his line of vision, he did not see it. And if there was something unholy being said, he did not hear it, and so on.
So in essence, it seems like with Adam Harishon, we have he was very unique in his design from the very beginning, and as the first man, and then you have as the first real God follower in the sense of Adonai Echad, serving one God unit in that sense. It's like Adam too had this gift of just this supernatural, like you said. I mean, all the senses were harnessed, if you will. Not, I guess that's probably a better way of putting it. I'm not sure, but it's very true, because with me or with you, well, I don't know about you, but I mean with me for sure. I mean, when I see things, when I hear things, it has a very huge impact on my next thought or my next move or my thoughts that happen the next 2 weeks from now, or my actions that happen the next day. It really does. It would be kind of nice to figure out how to get around that. So
it's not meant for everybody.
Got it.
But you see, even there, the Torah says that Chava, Eve, saw that the tree was appealing to be eaten. She saw,
Okay.
and it wasn't all good, at least according to some interpretations. So let's now go to the Parsha Vayeira. After God makes himself available to Avram, after God initiates the relationship, now it's time for Avram to reciprocate, to respond. So Vayeira is more about Avraham serving God than God coming to Avram. It all begins, the name of the Parsha is Vayeira, which means God appeared. Avram saw God. But then he looked up and he saw three people approaching, the angels whom he invited into the house. And then at the end of the Parsha, we read about the binding of Yitzhak, the Akedah.
Mm-hmm.
He went to the place that God had told him to go to, and he raised his eyes and he saw it from a distance. And then when he was told not to sacrifice Yitzhak, he raised his eyes and he saw the ram stuck in the bushes, in the thicket. And then he called the place, he named that place, the mountain where God was seen. So we see that the theme of Vayeira is vision.
Right.
The people in Sodom were punished in that they became blind. They had no vision. And that must have been an appropriate poetic justice. They were so blind to their neighbor's needs, to the needs of the stranger, that the punishment was that they became physically blind. So it's all about seeing, with the one exception that Sarah, when the angel told Avram that Sarah would have a child, Sarah heard, and she was in the door of her tent behind Avram. She heard. So there are two women that we need to talk about. Two mothers. Sarah, which we read about in the Parsha, and then the Shunamit, which we read about in the Haftarah. So the Haftarah for this week is the story of the miraculous birth that was a blessing from the prophet who was a student of Elijah, of Eliyahu, Elisha the prophet of his generation, or the seer of his generation. And he blessed this woman with a child. She was barren, and she had a child. Like the birth of Yitzhak was miraculous and the result of a blessing. But then the story goes on to say that the child died, and she came back to Elisha, and Elisha resurrected the child and brought him back to life.
Right.
Story of two mothers. And just when we think we know the story, we discover that there is so much more to know. It is so much deeper than we thought. Two strange things. When the angel told Avram, this time next year, Sarah will have a son. This time next year, which means 12 months from now, because it does take 12 months for a child to be born. There are 9 months of gestation, but there are also a few months in which the soul in heaven needs to adjust and accept and get comfortable with the idea that it's going to leave heaven and come down into a physical body and so on. So it is a 12-month process altogether. So the angel tells Avram, this time next year, with absolute certainty, Sarah will have a son. Sarah hears this and she laughs. And the angel says to Avram, why is Sarah laughing? Is anything impossible for God? And Avram asks Sarah, why did you laugh? And she says, I didn't laugh. And that's the end of the conversation.
It's reflecting back on the other video. That was so perfect. Yeah.
Sounds a little too familiar.
Especially whenever you get the eye. I'm just kidding. My wife, she's a sweetheart. But sometimes will say something, and then I just know when it's time to walk away. Oh, man.
An end of conversation. Yep. Abrupt.
Yeah.
So here's the question.
Okay.
Sarah was a prophet, in some way greater than Avram. How is it possible that she hears the blessing of an angel and she laughs? And as the angel said, is anything impossible for God? What are you laughing about? Right? Mm-hmm. So it's a little hard to imagine that Sarah would not have the required faith and that she had given up on having a child. Then we look into the Haftorah and we find another mother. Elisha says to this Shunammite, this time next year, without a doubt, you will cuddle a son. And the Shunammite says, please, don't tease me. Same question. This is the prophet of the generation talking. She appreciates his holiness because she addresses him as man of God. And she says, no, man of God, don't lie to me. How is that possible? Strange. What's even more interesting is, if you say no to a blessing, it doesn't happen. If you're closed, then the blessing doesn't come. So if she said no, why did she conceive and give birth to a son? By the way, her son grew up to be the prophet Habakkuk. So why did it happen if she said no? And also, how could she say no? This is the prophet of the generation, and she appreciates how holy he is and how godly he is, and yet she dismisses his blessing so bluntly, so cavalierly. So, let's take a closer look. When Elisha the prophet said to the Shunammite, this time next year, as sure as you are alive today, it sounded very familiar to her because that's what the angel said to Sarah.
Okay.
But then Elisha says, as sure as you are alive today, you will cuddle a son. She didn't like what she heard. She said, what do you mean cuddle? You don't cuddle a son forever. What about when he's too old to cuddle? This sounds like a very temporary blessing. I'm going to have him for as long as he's cuddly, and then I'm not going to have him. You call this a blessing? That's a tease. So she said, don't tease me. In other words, she was saying, give me a blessing of a long life for my son. Right. And Elisha said, fine. He will live long. And that's why, as soon as he was no longer cuddly, as the verse says, when he went out with his father to the harvest, he died. So she comes to Elisha and she says, don't we have a deal? Did I ask for a child? Did I not say, don't tease me? So Elisha had no choice but to resurrect the child because he had promised that it would live long.
Now, question: whenever during that resurrection time, he says he went to the upper room and he laid on the child hand to hand, face to face, but he didn't come to life the first time. It's like he had to do it a second time. Is there
seven times?
7 times. Is there what lesson is that for us or for this type of situation? You know, I mean, why didn't he give up the first time, and why didn't God just bless him the first time? Was it a lot like whenever when I forget which colonel it was, had to go bathe in the river 7 times? Is it sort of the same thing? And did Elijah know this?
Yes, he did.
He did know this. Okay.
But it's also interesting that when he gave her a blessing to have a child, he didn't do any of these Kabbalistic, holy activities. He simply said, "You're going to have," and so she did. But when it comes to resurrecting a dead child, it seems you need more than just a blessing. Here he had to pray. It says he prayed. Mm-hmm. And then he did this warming thing. And then he did this Kabbalistic thing with 7 times and pacing in the north-south or east-west or something like that. So there was some Kabbalah holy stuff being done as well, because to resurrect a dead child is tampering with nature more than if you give a barren woman the ability to have a child.
Interesting. So this may sound very Hollywoodish, but so in a way, was that Kabbalistic handling of that situation sort of like a way to undo a butterfly effect, so to speak? You know, in Hollywood they'll say if you do something to change a future event, just by doing it, it dominoes off and causes all these other problems. So I mean, maybe because of handling it this way, it protected all the environments around it. I don't know. That sounds kind of crazy, but
I have no idea.
I don't either.
Okay.
That's okay. Okay.
But it's obvious that there was much more effort necessary.
Right.
Okay. So what we know now is that when she said, "Don't tease me," she had no doubt that the blessing would happen. She never doubted the words of the prophet. She heard something that alerted her to the fact that the child would not live long. What did she hear? She heard the difference between the angel's blessing to Sarah and Elisha's blessing to her. The angel said, "This time next year, Sarah will have a son." That sounds firm. That sounds real.
Right.
Cuddle a son, that didn't sound good. So she lobbied for her son's life, that he should live long, and she prevailed.
Why do you think that, and again, this probably pure speculation, but why would it have been that the prophet would have granted her a son up front that was going to die young? Why would that even be the case anyway?
When a holy person or even an angel gives a blessing, he's simply facilitating whatever it is God was offering.
Gotcha. Okay.
So he may have been surprised himself at the wording.
Right.
And why did I say that?
Yeah. Right.
So now let's look back at Sarah.
Okay.
The angel says, the full story. The angel says to Avram, "This time next year, as surely as you are alive, Sarah will have a son." Then Sarah laughs. And the angel says, "Is anything impossible for God? At the appointed time, I will return to you," to Avram, "and Sarah will have her son." Lamayed, at the appropriate time, Ashuv elecha, I will return to you, ulasara bain, and Sarah will have her son.
Nice.
Now the question is, why does the angel have to return to Avram for Sarah to have a son? we've always assumed that this appropriate time that the angel said was the same time as this time next year, right?
Okay.
But now we have to look at it a little differently. Sarah didn't laugh because she had doubts. She didn't laugh because of a lack of faith. She laughed because she sensed that it would be temporary, that Yitzhak is not meant to live long. There will be the binding of Yitzhak, and he will be sacrificed. So she laughed as if to say, that kind of a blessing is not a real blessing. That's a joke.
Got it.
So she was lobbying that Yitzhak live a long life, to which the angel said, is anything impossible for God? Fine. He'll live long.
Interesting.
That's why the angel said to Avram, at the appropriate time, meaning when you're about to sacrifice him, I will come to you and I will stop you so that Sarah can have her son.
How about that?
And what actually happened? Avram was about to sacrifice his son, and an angel came and told him not to do it. God told him to do it, an angel came and told him not to do it.
That's amazing.
Right. So one lesson we draw from that is that to sacrifice a child, you have to hear it from God himself. To not sacrifice the child, it's enough to hear it from an angel.
Right. Just need an excuse to stop. Okay, so how much...
No, but there's more.
Okay.
Much more. When the angel came to Avram and said, don't do it, Avram asked a very legitimate, obvious question. Who are you? You're telling me not to do it? I have instructions from God. Who are you? And the angel said, you don't recognize me. This was 37 years later, 38 years later. Yitzhak was 37 at the time. So the angel said, you don't recognize me. I'm the one who gave you the blessing that you were going to have a son, and I'm the one who promised Sarah that he would live long. So I can't let you do this.
Interesting.
Now, what did Sarah hear that tipped her off that he would not live long? The Shunammite was tipped off by the fact that the blessing didn't sound like the blessing given to Sarah. But what was wrong with the blessing from the angel to Sarah? What did she hear? See, because Avram didn't lobby for Yitzhak to live long. Why did Sarah? So here's what Sarah picked up. Every blessing has to be given face to face, one-on-one. The angel said to Avram, this time next year, Sarah will have a son. And Sarah said, whoa, this is not good. If it's a blessing to me, then talk to me. If you want to give Avram a blessing, then tell him that he'll have a son. But to say to Avram that Sarah is going to have a son, this doesn't work. So she realized this is going to be temporary. So she lobbied for the life of her son. So in both cases, we're reading about mothers whose insight came not by vision, insight, not by sight, but by hearing. They heard something that seers don't hear. And in fact, we find where God tells Avram, Everything Sarah tells you, listen to her. You have the gift of seeing, but you got to hear what she says. Or she has the gift of hearing. And you might say that the reason that they had the gift of hearing, which is in some way more insightful than seeing, is because of the maternal instinct. This concerned their child. They were going to hear things nobody else hears. So, we usually say you can't compare hearing to seeing. Seeing is believing. When you see, then you really know. Then everything is clear and obvious. Whereas with hearing, it's not so sharp, it's not so focused, it's not so convincing. And that's true. But there's something about hearing that seeing doesn't have. You don't see what's not there, but you can hear what was not said. Reading between the lines doesn't come from vision, it comes from hearing, from being tuned in. So active hearing, really paying attention, can tell you more than looking at the picture. So Avraham's gift, every prophet, is a seer. They see the picture, and they see it clearly, but then they have to interpret it. Whereas when you hear the message. You don't have to interpret. You're not looking at an image and trying to understand what it means. You're hearing what it means, and you have to put an image to it in your mind's eye. So you pick up stuff that you would not if you were using vision. So in some way, although the name of the Parsha is seeing, and Avraham saw over and over again, the surprise, the little surprise nugget in the Parsha is that Sarah heard. And as a result, Yitzhak's life was a long life. And the Shunammite heard, and that's why we have the prophet Habakkuk.
Have you dealt with the Akedah on a missionary standpoint before?
What is a missionary standpoint?
Well, I mean, in the eyes of a counter-missionary like Rabbi Tovia Singer. This is because I was a Christian for many years and I became Messianic before I left the New Testament behind completely. And one of the things that people would say, this is at the time when I was a Christian, they would say, well, human sacrifice is forbidden. And so my response would be, well, why did God command Abraham to kill Isaac then? So, and that same argument is very, very prominent in Christian theology and Messianic theology. So I didn't know if you had dealt with that before. And if you have, how do you address it with others?
Well, the obvious message right from the beginning of the story, the Torah says, and God tested Avram.
Nice. Yeah, that's very clear.
And asked him to do this.
Right.
So it was never meant to happen.
That is a really great point, because even in Deuteronomy 13, where it says God is testing you in this to see if you'll follow after these other gods. It's the same testing. So God doesn't want his people to follow after other gods. God didn't want him to sacrifice. That is really, really great. I've never connected that before. Thank you. That's really awesome.
The question is, why was Avraham not aware of this? I mean, if he was aware, then it's not a test.
Right.
He obviously thought God meant for him to sacrifice Yitzhak. How come he didn't object?
Right.
See, there's a difference between God telling Avram that he's going to destroy the city of Sodom, and Avram argues. and objects and tries to defend them. Why didn't he try to defend Yitzhak? You can't compare the two. God came to Avram and said, the people of Sodom are exceedingly wicked. I want to destroy them. So Avram defended them. With Yitzhak, God didn't say, I want to destroy him. He said, I want him back in heaven. Raise him up on the altar. What was there to defend? The miracle was that Avram was not jealous. So at that time, going back to heaven legally, without murder, going back to heaven was the ultimate blessing in the thinking in the thinking of the time. So God comes to Avram and says, Yitzhak is a very holy kid. He's a very holy soul. He's had enough of this world. Send him back home. What could Avram say? How could you do this? He's a good boy. Why is he suffering? He's not suffering. He's going back to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So he couldn't argue. There was no argument. There was nothing to defend. The test was, can you function without him and continue in spreading the knowledge of God, even though you won't have someone to continue your project after you pass away? So God then comes and says, don't do it. Don't touch him. Nothing. Which means this was the first time that God introduced this fantastic idea that being on earth is more important than being in heaven. And he introduced it very dramatically. That's when we found out why human sacrifice is not kosher. If going to heaven is better, if being in heaven is more important, then human sacrifice makes sense. It's not even a sacrifice.
Right.
It's a promotion.
Right. You're basically transplanting.
It's a step up.
Right.
And that's how people thought. Heaven is higher than earth, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Now God comes and says, no, don't do it. Well, why not? What, did Yitzhak sin and blow it? God is telling him, much more important to stay on earth than to come back to heaven. And that's very deeply implanted in the Jewish psyche since that moment. We don't want to go to heaven. We're not looking forward to going to heaven. We don't think the pleasure of being in heaven justifies leaving earth, because here we can serve God. In heaven, God serves us. And we would rather serve than be served. That was the message that Avraham received at the Akedah.
Okay, going up to in Genesis 18, I think it's further down, maybe verse 19, or maybe it's further down. You have to kind of guide me to it, I think. There's a spot on there where Hashem, where Hashem basically says, there's the big claim against Sodom and Gomorrah, and it says, I will go down myself and see whether or not the claims made against them, whether they're true or not. And so a lot of curiosity out there. Does God know the future of every single event? Does free will exist? If it does, how do those two balance out using the information in chapter 18 Genesis?
Yeah, it's the old question.
Awesome.
If God has it all planned out, how can we have freedom of choice? On a simple level, when you have a psychologist who predicts how you're going to behave under a certain crisis, how can the psychiatrist know accurately? How can he predict? The answer is, he knows how you're wired, he knows how you're programmed, he knows what pushes your buttons, and therefore can predict how you're going to behave because you're locked into this condition, meaning you don't have free choice. So if someone hurts your feelings, you're going to react this way automatically because that's how you're wired. So we think that if God knows what I'm going to do, it must be like the psychiatrist. Knowing how I'm wired, he can predict how I'm going to behave, which means I don't have freedom of choice. I'm robotic. I'm pre-programmed. But that's not really the case. It's more like when a prophet who can see the future tells you what lies in the future, he's not interfering with your freedom of choice at all. God doesn't need to program you in order to know how you're going to behave, because the present, the past, and the future all exist simultaneously for God. So God sees your choices as you make them. He doesn't need to influence them. So being in the future, God sees you behaving in the future. So God knows what you're going to do before you know what you're going to do, but not before you do it. Because for God, there is no before. That makes sense?
Right, right.
So it's like Superman breaking through the time barrier, going into the future, seeing what you do, and then come back and tell you. So he's certainly not interfering with your choice. He's simply reporting on your choice. He saw you choosing it. But there's something even more meaningful than that. When God created the world, he saw everything, every detail of every event, of all of history, and so on. Based on what he saw, he created a plan. In other words, seeing the choices that human beings make, he planned accordingly. So we usually think God made a plan, then human beings came along and mess up the plan.
We're good at that.
Right. And now God has to scramble, for plan B, for the alternative plan. No, that's not the way it goes. All of divine providence, all that God has planned, is planned around our choices. So we really, literally are partners in creation. Because everything that God does, he's doing in response to our choices. And I think that's what it means. God said, I will go down to see if they are as bad as they sound. What does it mean he has to go down and check? It means his decision is affected by how we behave.
Interesting.
And that's called justice. Justice means it depends on how you behave, depends on your circumstances, depends on the conditions. Sometimes there are mitigating circumstances. So you can't say, if you do this, you get punished by death. Well, if you do this knowingly, intentionally, premeditated, with witnesses, then, but not automatically, because then there's no judgment. There is no justice. So if every sin has a prescribed punishment, and that's what you apply, there's no justice. because two people can commit the same sin, and justice demands very different reactions. One person did it out of ignorance, innocently, maybe even meant well, had no idea what he was doing, etc., etc. The other person is malicious, and if he won't succeed the first time, he'll try again because he is determined to be evil. You can't treat them the same way.
That's true. So what do we have for practical application for us, besides husbands not arguing with their wives?
Whoa, that's a big one.
Oh, I know what I wanted you to touch on real fast before we get completely gone. The name changes from Avram to Avraham, and Sarai replaced with the Hey, taking the Yud out. Talk to us a little bit about the significance. I mean, we know that changed from princess to queen, the major names, but you mentioned things yesterday like the gematria of the letter and the senses and things. I'd like for the people to actually hear a little bit more on.
I think the significance of a name is not fully appreciated. Why do we have names? We find right in the beginning in Bereshit, God gives names to things. God gives names. He called the light day and he called the darkness night. Afterwards, God gave Adam the job of naming things. But at the beginning, God himself named things. What is the significance of naming things? God created the world by saying, "Let there be." God said, "Let there be light." What does the word light mean? The miracle was, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Isn't that amazing?
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Whatever responded to God's command, how did they know what light meant? How does light know what light is? It's just a word. God said, "Let the earth give forth vegetation." Well, what's vegetation? What does that word mean? How did it result in plants, grass, trees, and flowers? The letters with which God created the world are the building blocks of existence. When you combine letters a certain way, they produce a certain creature. So the letters, for example, Aleph, Vav, Resh, which is how you spell relief, how you spell light in Hebrew, they produce a certain creature. Are we okay?
Yeah, we're good. Sorry, there was a video playing in the background. I apologize.
Yeah. So when God said, "Let there be light," he was actually saying, "Let there be Aleph, Vav, Resh," which describes the properties of light.
Interesting.
Like a formula, like H2O. If you want to say, "Let there be water," you have to say, "Let there be H2O."
Nice. Very nice.
And even that's not good enough because nobody knows what oxygen is or what hydrogen is because they're just words. So the Hebrew letters with which God created the world are much more than letters and words. They are the code for the properties and the nature of the things that God is creating. In other words, to go from God's intention, like what God envisioned grass to be, how did that get translated into actual grass? The name, or in that case, the word, is the channel through which God's intention becomes fact. In the human being, our name is what allows our soul to connect to our body. because by nature they should not be compatible at all. The body is a non-living mineral, and the soul is a living being. How a living being can give life to a dead object is mysterious. We have no idea how that works. But we do know that the name facilitates that connection. So the name is like the arteries through which the soul delivers life to the body. Sometimes adding a name can extend your life. Because you have another name, you have more channels for life. And sometimes changing a name.
Is that possibly why Hagar her name was changed instead of when she returned and when she did teshuvah when
she converted?
She converted. Thank you. And then her name became Keturah, right?
Right.
So is that why also in Judaism in general, when somebody converts, they give them a new name?
Well, now that they have a Jewish soul,
right,
you have to create channels for the Jewish soul to connect to the body.
Wow, that's so deep. Oh man, that's actually kind of emotional for me for some reason. I don't know why, but okay.
And that's why when we pick a name, it's a bit of a prophecy. Because intuitively we pick the right name for the child, because you can't just make up a name. These are the letters that channel life from the soul to the body for this particular person. How did you know that when you named your child? Mm-hmm. So every naming of a child is a little bit of a prophecy. It's an inspired choice.
If I told people, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And that's why we shouldn't interfere. We shouldn't tell people what to name their child. Let it come naturally.
If I told people out there that my family has a tradition that when we have like acid reflux or something on our chest, we always it's our rule in our family that we have to lay on our left side when we sleep. A lot of people think I was nuts, but if I told people, well, the reason why I lay on my left side if I'm feeling acidic in my chest is because the positioning of your heart and your esophagus and stuff, it actually relieves it on that. So there's a physical reason why people do that, and I bring that up because for many years I kind of scoffed at, I made fun at traditions of Judaism before I studied it out, and it's interesting to see how perceptions change as you research things. And so why is it that people are so quick to just completely dismiss Judaism and these things like naming your child with a specific name? I mean, there's people who know nothing about Judaism who would never name their son Jeffrey because of the murderer Jeffrey Dahmer. And it's like, they're like, I am not taking any chances. Well, why would you think there was a chance if you don't think there's a connection somewhere? And so I find it very, very enlightening. Wow, this is awesome, man.
Right. We don't believe in things we're supposed to believe in, but
right.
We're superstitious.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, there you go. That's right. Wow, that's deep. Whew. Unbelievable. So what's the message for us? What's our application for this Parsha? How can this be carried into our homes, this week's Parsha?
Oh, there's so much. It's such a rich Parsha, full of incredible stories. How to avoid turning into a pillar of salt.
That could be a very valuable lesson.
Yeah, and you're not going to find any advice on that other than in this Parsha.
That's great.
There's no place else where they talk about not becoming a pillar of salt.
Oh.
Salt is a preservative.
Mm-hmm.
When you salt something, you prevent it from changing.
Okay.
Right? Looking back means resisting change. When something is over, don't look back. because then you get salted. you get pickled, and you resist change, and you can't go on. So the message there is, when something was bad and it's over, don't go back. Don't keep digging it up, and don't keep rehashing it, and don't keep rethinking it. It's done. It's over. Move on. Very important.
That's why God put the eyes in front of our head, right?
Don't become a pillar of salt. Like that famous joke about the guy who comes in from the desert and he's so thirsty. I'm so thirsty. They finally give him a drink of water and he says, "Oy, was I thirsty? I used to be so thirsty." Okay, it's over. Stop it. I was in so much trouble. Yeah, but you're not anymore.
Right.
Move on.
I saw a cartoon deal that captured that thought. It was an advertisement for a kids cartoon movie or something, and it's like they showed this one little character there, like terrorized because he says, "Oh my God, someday I'm going to die," and he's like panicking. And the little other character that was with him, he said, "Yes, but every other day you will live." I'm like, think of it that way, don't meditate on those things that'll bring you into this pre-death state, if you will. Is there something, Rabbi, to the men hearing and the women, the men seeing and the women hearing, where that could connect with the pillar of salt, where maybe she should have been only listening and only hearing, instead she wanted to see, and that caused her demise? Is there any truth to that as a general blanket statement?
Generally speaking, we could say correctly that seeing is masculine and hearing is feminine.
Okay, gotcha.
But the ability to listen and to really hear, it is such a divine character, such a divine trait. Just listening to someone can save their life, make the difference between life and death. When you feel heard, you feel alive. When you feel unheard, you feel like you're not alive. So the biggest gift we can give someone is to simply hear them.
Especially our wife and our children.
You don't have a solution. You don't have great advice. You're not going to fix their problem. You're just going to hear it. And you've solved at least half of the problem.
Wow.